The universe was dying, not slowly, not quietly. It was collapsing into permanent, unforgiving darkness, star by star, system by system. Every civilization in the known galaxy had already written their final prayers. Every species had already accepted the end. Every species except one. Hit that like button, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment. Could humanity actually pull this off? Now, let's step into the cold. The year was 2847, but the calendar meant nothing anymore. Time was measured differently now, not in years or decades, but in stellar deaths. Every 43 days, another star crossed the threshold. Another sun dimmed beyond recovery, its core too cold, its fusion flame too exhausted to sustain itself. The Milky Way, once a galaxy of 400 billion burning lights, had been reduced to a graveyard of cooling embers and frozen iron cores drifting silently through the void. Commander David Harlan stood at the observation deck of Outpost Meridian, the last functioning deep space command station in the outer spiral arm. He was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like weathered granite and eyes that had stopped flinching at bad news somewhere around his third decade in the Galactic Engineering Corps. He held a data tablet in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. He hadn't slept in 31 hours. The numbers on the tablet were not new. He had read them 6 times already, but reading them again didn't make them easier to process. Stellar decay rate accelerating. Projected complete galactic extinction, 214 years. Margin of error, plus or minus 9 years. 9 years of error on a death sentence for every living thing in the galaxy. David set the tablet face down on the railing and looked out at the stars, or what remained of them. Where once the outer arm had blazed with thousands of visible suns, now there were clusters of dead white dwarfs, brown dwarfs too dim to see, and the occasional neutron star pulsing like a dying heartbeat in a silent hospital room. The Great Chill, as the scientific community called it, had accelerated beyond every model they had built. The Velhari had called it the final humility, the cosmic lesson that all life must one day bow before entropy. They were an ancient species, silicon-based, with civilizations older than Earth's sun. They had stopped building ships 3 decades ago. Their last broadcast to the Galactic Communication Network was a 90-minute philosophical meditation on the beauty of endings. They had gone silent after that. The Dren Collective, a hive-minded fungal species from the Cygnus sector, had dissolved their unified consciousness voluntarily. Their final coordinated message to the network simply read, "We choose stillness over struggle. May the cold be gentle." The Etheric Convocation, 14 species bound by a shared energy framework, had voted unanimously at their last summit to cease all megastructure construction and redirect remaining resources toward what they called graceful deceleration. In plain terms, they were spending their last centuries making themselves comfortable before the lights went out. Across the galaxy, the consensus was the same. The universe was winding down. The heat death was not a distant theoretical. It was here, it was measurable, and it was winning. The only rational response, according to every major alien civilization, was acceptance. David Harlan did not accept things easily. He turned away from the stars and walked back into the station's main operations room. 12 engineers sat at their workstations, none of them speaking. The room had a sound, the low hum of processors and life support systems, but no voices. Everyone was tired. Everyone was carrying the weight of the same impossible math. At the center of the room, projected in blue light above the central console, was a holographic model of a white dwarf. Designation: WD 7714 Kira. Formerly, the star of a system that had supported 2 alien civilizations before they abandoned it 40 years ago. Now it was a sphere of compressed carbon and oxygen roughly the size of Earth, its surface temperature still measurable but falling. In approximately 60 years, WD 7714 Kira would cross the black dwarf threshold. a temperature so low that not even theoretical chemistry could sustain a reaction on its surface. 60 years. Commander. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Aaron Cole, 29, the youngest senior engineer on the station, and the one who had been running simulations for the past 72 hours without a full sleep cycle. He had dark circles under his eyes and a smear of graphite on his left forearm from the paper calculations he still ran by hand when he didn't trust the computers. The latest compression model is ready. David walked to the console. He looked at the simulation. He looked at the numbers. He looked at Aaron. What's the probability of ignition? Aaron didn't hesitate. 11.3%, under optimal conditions. The room went quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone is pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. David nodded slowly. And the probability if we use the kinetic anchor array we discussed last Thursday. Aaron pulled up a second model. The numbers shifted. 31.7%. Someone at a back workstation exhaled audibly. 31% was not good odds, but it was not zero. And in a galaxy that had already accepted zero, 31% felt like a revolution. David picked up the tablet again, turned it over, and looked at the stellar decay numbers one more time. Then he set it down and said 3 words that would eventually reshape the galaxy. Build the anchor. Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Aaron Cole turned back to his workstation, cracked his knuckles, and began typing. And the first chapter of humanity's most audacious gamble had already begun before anyone else in the universe even knew the bet had been placed. The construction order went out at 400 station time, and by 600, every fabrication bay on Outpost Meridian was running at full capacity. David Harlan had not filed the order through the Galactic Engineering Oversight Committee. He had not submitted it to the Human Unified Council for review. He had not sent a courtesy notification to any of the 14 member species of the Etheric Convocation. He had authorized it under Emergency Directive 9. A provision written into the core charter 80 years ago, designed for situations where waiting for approval would cost more than the risk of acting alone. He knew what that choice meant. He made it anyway. The kinetic anchor concept had existed in theoretical physics for over a century. The core idea was elegant in the way that truly dangerous ideas always are, elegant enough to seem obvious in hindsight, and terrifying enough that no one had ever seriously attempted to build one. A kinetic anchor was, in its simplest description, a tethering system. A way to attach a massive artificial structure to a celestial body and use precisely calibrated force applications to manipulate that body's inertia. Not its orbit, not its spin. Its inertia, the deep structural momentum of the object at the quantum mechanical level. In practical terms, it meant grabbing a dead star and squeezing. The theory suggested that if a sufficiently massive kinetic anchor array was attached to a white dwarf and activated in a synchronized compression sequence, the resulting pressure increase at the dwarf's iron core could, under the right conditions, with the right timing, with the right energy input, trigger a renewed fusion cascade. Not a supernova, not an explosion, a controlled, sustained restart of stellar fusion. A dead star brought back to life. The physics community had called it mathematically possible and practically insane for 90 years. The reason no one had built it was not lack of intelligence. It was lack of will. Restarting a star required an initial energy investment that no single civilization had been willing to commit, because the energy had to come from somewhere. And in a dying galaxy, energy was the one thing nobody wanted to spend on a 31% chance. David Harlan was spending it. Lieutenant Aaron Cole ran the engineering teams in overlapping 12-hour shifts. The anchor components were not being built from scratch. The core had been quietly stockpiling modular megastructure components for a decade, officially designated for deep space habitat expansion. In reality, David had been preparing for this for years. He had read the stellar decay projections long before they became public knowledge, and he had made decisions then that he had told no one about until now. Chief Engineer Marcus Webb, 55, the oldest member of the senior staff and the most technically experienced man David had ever worked with, was the first to understand the full scope of what was being built. "You've been prepositioning materials for 7 years," Marcus said, standing beside David in the fabrication bay, watching automated assemblers piece together anchor strut sections the size of office buildings. His voice was flat, not accusatory, just precise. Marcus was always precise. David said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The Oversight Committee is going to know within 72 hours. The energy signature from the fabricators is too large to hide." "I know. They'll send a formal objection." "They will." "And the convocation?" Marcus asked. "The Velhari alone have 3 monitoring stations within sensor range of this system." "I know that too." Marcus turned and looked at him directly. "And you're doing it anyway." "Someone has to." That was the entire argument. Not a speech, not a manifesto, just a statement of fact from a man who had looked at the numbers and decided that the galaxy's collective resignation was not a decision he was willing to inherit. The anchor array took 11 days to assemble in the fabrication bays, and another 6 days to transport and position around WD 7714 Kira via a fleet of 17 heavy-lift platform ships. During that time, exactly what David had predicted came true. The Galactic Engineering Oversight Committee sent a formal notice of concern on Day 4. On Day 9, it became a formal notice of violation. On Day 14, the etheric convocation transmitted a strongly worded collective statement urging immediate cessation of unilateral stellar interference operations. David read each message carefully. He responded to each one with the same 3 sentences. "The operation is proceeding under Emergency Directive 9. Full technical documentation will be provided upon completion. Humanity accepts full responsibility for outcomes." On Day 17, the anchor array was in position. The structure was unlike anything previously built by any species in the recorded history of the galaxy. 16 anchor arms, each 3,000 kilometers in length, curved around WD 7714 Kira in a configuration that looked, from a distance, like an open hand reaching around a marble. The arms were connected at their bases by a continuous ring structure, the first primitive version of what would later be called the Dyson ring, which housed the power generation systems, the compression sequencers, and the control infrastructure that Aaron Cole had been refining around the clock. At the center of it all sat a dead star that had been cooling for 40 years, completely unaware that 1,100 human engineers had just decided it was going to burn again. David stood in the command center of Platform 1, the lead ship in the operation, and looked at the status display showing all 16 anchor arms locked and calibrated. "Compression sequence ready," Aaron said from his station. "Power reserves 94%, within acceptable range." David looked at the white dwarf on the display. It looked impossibly small for something so consequential. A sphere of compressed stellar matter roughly the size of a small planet, silent and frozen, drifting in the dark. "Marcus," David said, "final structural assessment." Marcus looked up from his console. "The anchors will hold. I'd stake my career on it." "You are staking your career on it." "Then I'm confident." David almost smiled, almost. "Aaron, initiate compression sequence, Stage 1. The anchor arms began to move slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, each one applying calibrated inward pressure along its designated contact arc. The white dwarf didn't react visibly. At this stage, nothing visible was supposed to happen. The physics were operating at a scale far below the observable, deep in the quantum structure of the star's iron core, where pressure and temperature were beginning, very slowly, very carefully, to climb. For 47 minutes, nothing happened that anyone could see. Then the sensors registered it. A temperature increase, 0.03%, statistically insignificant, physically extraordinary. Aaron looked at David. His voice was very quiet. It's responding. The room did not erupt in cheers. These were engineers. They knew that 0.03% was not ignition. It was a tremor. It was the universe being pushed, and the universe pushing back slightly less hard than expected. But it was something. And in a galaxy that had nothing left, something was everything. The compression continued. The temperature climbed, slowly, incrementally, and 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning by Earth calendar reckoning, a white dwarf that had been dead for 4 decades began, for the first time, to glow. Not brightly, not yet, but it glowed. And somewhere across the galaxy, in 14 civilizations that had already written their final prayers, a sensor array registered an anomalous heat signature from a dead star in the outer spiral arm. They didn't know what it meant yet, but they were about to find out. The first transmission came from the Velhari on the 31st day of the operation. It was not a message of congratulations. It was not even a message of curiosity. It was a formal diplomatic communique from the Velhari High Deliberation Council, and it arrived in 6 simultaneous languages, which meant they considered it important enough to eliminate any possibility of translation error. The core of the message was simple. What you are doing is a violation of the Cosmic Accord of 2601, which prohibits unilateral interference with naturally occurring celestial phenomena. Cease operations immediately. Submit to review. David Harlan read it twice, forwarded it to the core legal archive, and returned to the compression sequencing data. The star, they had started calling it Kira informally after its designation, was now producing measurable light output, not enough to warm a planet, not enough to be seen from any inhabited system with the naked eye. But the fusion cascade in the core had moved from theoretical tremor to confirmed, sustained reaction. Aaron's models showed it stabilizing into a genuine, if fragile, stellar burn within another 40 days. 40 days. The Oversight Committee had now escalated its notices to the level of formal sanction. The Human Unified Council, under political pressure from multiple convocation members, had transmitted a request, carefully worded as a request, not an order, asking David to pause operations pending review. He responded with the same 3 sentences. What changed on day 31 was not the political pressure. That had been expected. What changed was the second transmission, this one from an unexpected source. The Dren Collective had gone silent 18 years ago. Their distributed consciousness had dissolved. Their communication infrastructure had been left running on automated systems, broadcasting nothing except periodic technical pings that confirmed the hardware was still functional. Nobody had expected to hear from them. The message was short, barely 40 words in translated form. It arrived on a frequency the Dren had not used in nearly 2 decades. We have detected thermal output from WD 7714 Kira. Our sensors confirm sustained fusion reaction. We do not understand how this is possible. We are curious. Please respond. David read it 3 times. Then he handed the tablet to Marcus without saying anything. Marcus read it, set it down, said, "Huh." That was the entirety of their initial response to the first crack in the galaxy's collective surrender. 2 men in a command center looking at 40 words from a civilization that had dissolved itself and saying nothing for a long moment. Then David picked up a transmission headset and began composing a reply to the Dren. He told them everything, not a summary, not a political statement, Everything, the physics, the anchor design, the compression sequence, the probability models, the energy investment, the violation notices he had received and ignored. He sent it all, unfiltered, with full technical documentation attached. The Dren took 11 hours to respond. Their second message was longer, much longer. It included 17 technical questions about the kinetic anchor mechanism, 4 requests for clarification on the energy sourcing methodology, and 1 line at the very end that Aaron read aloud to the room because he thought everyone should hear it. If this works at scale, why did no one try it sooner? Nobody had a clean answer for that. The truthful answer was complicated. It involved institutional inertia, resource politics, the deep psychological weight of accepting an inevitable outcome, and the particular human stubbornness that other species had, for centuries, considered both a flaw and an anomaly. On day 44, Kira achieved stable ignition. The moment was not marked with ceremony. Aaron ran the confirmation sequence 3 times before he announced it, and even then his voice was careful and measured. Sustained fusion confirmed. Output stable at 0.08 solar luminosity. Projected self-maintenance, indefinite under current anchor support. 0.08, less than 1/10 of a normal star's output. But it was burning on its own, sustained. WD 7714 Kira was alive again. David authorized a full technical report and broadcast it openly on every available galactic communication network frequency. No restrictions. No embargo. He wanted every species, every government, every research institution in the galaxy to have the complete data immediately. The response was immediate and divided. The Oversight Committee formally suspended humanity's membership in the Galactic Engineering Consortium, pending a full investigation. 3 convocation member species issued public statements condemning the operation as reckless interference with cosmic natural law. The Velhari High Deliberation Council requested an emergency summit. And from 17 other species, smaller civilizations, less politically connected, many of them in systems that were already dark or nearly dark, came a different kind of message. Not condemnations, not formal objections. Requests. Quiet, careful, some of them almost apologetic in tone, but requests. Could the same process be applied to their system star? Did humanity have the resources to replicate the anchor array? Was there a timeline for expansion? David read every single one of them personally. He counted them on day 50. There were 31 requests from 12 different species. By day 60, there were 94 requests. By day 70, the number had crossed 200, and the political landscape of the galaxy had shifted in a way that no summit, no accord, no diplomatic framework had been designed to handle. Because the question was no longer whether humanity's method worked. The question was now something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more consequential for every living thing in the galaxy. The question was, who controls the fire? The emergency summit was held aboard the Neutral Space Platform Concordance Station, a structure originally built as a symbol of galactic cooperation. All clean lines, shared architecture, and the kind of deliberate aesthetic neutrality that made it look like it had been designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything. David Harlan arrived with a staff of 4, Aaron Cole, Marcus Webb, and 2 communications specialists named Grant Fisher and Thomas Reed. He had been offered a security escort by 3 separate species. He had declined all of them. The chamber held representatives from 61 species. Some were present physically, in environmental suits adapted for the station's mixed atmosphere common areas. Others attended via holographic proxy. The Velhari High Speaker, an ancient being whose physical form required a specialized mobile chamber to travel, occupied the center dais by prior agreement of the chamber's rules. David sat at the human delegation table, a single table, notably smaller than most others in the room, a detail he noticed and filed away, and waited for the proceedings to begin. The High Speaker's translated voice filled the chamber with the calm, measured cadence of a civilization that had been conducting diplomacy for 8,000 years. Commander Harlan, humanity has, without authorization, without consultation, and in direct violation of the cosmic accord, interfered with a naturally occurring stellar remnant. You have altered the fundamental state of a celestial body that existed under the protection of shared cosmic law. We are here to determine the appropriate response. David let a brief pause settle before responding, long enough to be deliberate, short enough not to be rude. With respect, High Speaker, the star was dead. It is no longer dead. I am prepared to discuss methodology, resource sharing, and expansion planning. I am not prepared to discuss undoing what has been done. The murmur that moved through the chamber was the kind that happens when someone says the thing everyone expected, but hoped wouldn't be said quite so directly. The Dren representative, surprisingly, the Dren had reconstituted a partial collective consciousness specifically to attend this summit, which was itself a significant event, transmitted through their interface system. The question of undoing is irrelevant. The question of what comes next is everything. We support continued operation. 3 species immediately objected. 2 others signaled support. The chamber was already fracturing along exactly the lines David had expected. The argument that followed lasted 9 hours. The species who opposed humanity's actions were not wrong in their reasoning. The cosmic accord was real. The principle of non-interference with natural cosmic phenomena had been a cornerstone of galactic cooperation for 6 centuries. There were legitimate concerns about unintended consequences. Stellar reignition at the scale David was proposing carried real risks of gravitational disturbances, radiation output miscalculation, and chain effect instabilities in nearby stellar remnants. These were not invented objections. They were grounded in solid physics. David listened to all of it. He had Marcus and Aaron provide technical rebuttals where the physics were disputed. He did not dismiss the concerns. He addressed them. But he did not yield the central point. When the High Speaker asked him, directly, whether he believed humanity had the right to make unilateral decisions affecting the entire galaxy, David gave an answer that was later broadcast on every major communication network in the known galaxy. I believe that when every other option is death, the species willing to attempt survival doesn't need permission. We tried to work within the framework. The framework had decided to die gracefully. We chose differently. If that's a violation, then yes, we violated it. And will violate it again as many times as necessary until every star in this galaxy is burning. The chamber was silent for 4 full seconds. Then 3 things happened simultaneously. The Velhari High Speaker called for a recess. The Dren representative transmitted a single word, yes. And Aaron Cole, sitting 3 seats to David's left, received an encrypted transmission on his personal relay from Outpost Meridian that made his face go very still. During the recess, in a corridor off the main chamber, Aaron pulled David aside. "We have a problem," Aaron said. "What kind?" Aaron handed him the transmission summary. David read it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very quiet and very focused. The kinetic anchor on Kira's southern arm had developed a structural stress fracture. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the stress readings were climbing at a rate that, if uncorrected, would result in a full arm failure within 72 hours. And a full arm failure on a reignited star meant one thing. The compression would become asymmetric, the fusion cascade destabilized. The star wouldn't explode, the physics didn't support that outcome, but it would go dark again. Permanently this time because the disruption would scatter the core material in a way that made future compression attempts impossible. Everything they had built, everything the Dren had reawakened hope for, everything the 94 requesting species were waiting on. All of it riding on a fracture developing in a structure 3,000 kilometers long, orbiting a star 200 light-years from the nearest repair facility. "How long do we have to get a repair team out there?" David asked. 51 hours if we leave in the next 3. David looked at the door back to the summit chamber. The Velhari high speaker was in there. 60 species were in there. The future of galactic diplomacy around humanity's entire program was being decided in there. He looked at Aaron. "Get the ship ready. You're leaving the summit. The summit can wait, the star can't." Aaron didn't argue. He was already moving. And David Harlan walked back into the chamber, informed the assembly that he had an urgent operational matter requiring his immediate personal attention, and walked out before the high speaker could formally object, leaving behind a room full of alien representatives who were, for the first time in centuries, not entirely sure whether they were watching recklessness or something they had forgotten the word for. The word was will. The repair ship Resolute departed Concordance Station at 3:40 and pushed its drive systems to 112% rated output, a threshold that technically required a maintenance review and technically nobody on that ship cared about at that moment. David stood in the Resolute's operations bay with Marcus, Aaron, and a structural repair team of 8 engineers led by a methodical, quiet specialist named Captain Brian Sato. Brian had spent 20 years repairing deep space megastructures in conditions ranging from bad to catastrophically bad. He had looked at the stress fracture data for 40 minutes and said only, doable, tight. For Brian Sato, tight was as close to optimistic as he got. The journey to WD 7714 Kira took 48 hours at sustained maximum drive. During that time, the fracture readings continued climbing. Not faster than projected, but exactly as projected, which was its own kind of dread, because it meant there was no positive deviation to hope for. At hour 36, something else happened. A ship appeared on the Resolute's long-range sensors, then a second, then a third, then 7 more. Aaron identified them first. Dren fabrication vessels, heavy-lift class. He paused, and 2 etheric convocation engineering platforms. David looked at the sensor display. They're heading to Kira. Same vector as us. They must have been monitoring the anchor telemetry. Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. They're coming to help. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. The Dren had no formal agreement with humanity. The convocation engineering platforms belonged to a member species that had voted against David's operation at the summit. They had come anyway, not because they had been asked, not because any accord required it, because they had been watching the data and they had done the math themselves, and they had decided, independently, without coordination, that the star staying lit mattered more than the political position they had taken in a chamber 3 days ago. David opened a communication channel to the lead Dren vessel. "This is Commander Harlan on the Resolute. We're glad you're here." The Dren response came in translated form, slightly delayed. "We are familiar with the repair requirements. Our fabrication systems can produce replacement anchor strut components to your design specifications in 11 hours. We will begin immediately." From the convocation platform, the response was shorter. Structural reinforcement team standing by, awaiting coordination. Brian Sato, who had been reviewing repair methodology at a side console, looked over at David with the expression of a man recalculating his timeline in real time. "That changes things," Brian said. "That changes things significantly." The joint operation that followed was, by any technical measure, one of the most complex structural repairs ever attempted on a megastructure in active operation around a live stellar body. The fracture was on the southern anchor arm's 3rd major stress joint, a section 340 kilometers from the arm's base, accessible only by EVA teams working in the electromagnetic environment immediately adjacent to a reigniting star. The light from Kira was still faint, 0.08 solar luminosity, but it was real. And it was warm, and working in that light felt, to the engineers running the EVA teams, like something they didn't have immediate words for. Brian coordinated the repair teams across 4 ships in 3 different communication frameworks simultaneously, issuing corrections and adjustments with the calm precision of someone who had decided the situation was under control and intended to enforce that decision through competence alone. The Dren fabrication units produced replacement strut components that were, notably, slightly better than the originals. The Dren had identified a design refinement that reduced stress concentration at the joint interface by 9%. They offered it without comment. Brian accepted it without ceremony. 41 hours after arriving at Kira, with 2 hours and 19 minutes remaining before the fracture would have reached critical threshold, the repair was complete. The stress reading stabilized, then dropped further as the reinforced joint settled into its load distribution pattern. Aaron ran the confirmation sequence from the Resolute's operations bay and reported the result in the same careful tone he used for everything. Anchor arm integrity restored, all 16 arms nominal, fusion cascade stable. The Dren vessel transmitted one word again, the same word they had sent at the summit. Yes. David looked out the viewport at Kira, at a star that should have been dead and wasn't, at a structure built in defiance of political consensus and cosmic resignation, at the faint, warm, impossible light of a sun that had come back from nothing because a group of people had decided 31% was enough to bet on. He opened a channel to all the ships assembled at Kira, human, Dren, convocation. This is Commander Harlan. The repair is complete. The star is stable. I want to thank everyone here, every team, every ship, everyone who made the calculation that this was worth coming for. He paused. We just proved something today, not just that the anchor works. We proved that when something is worth saving, you don't wait for permission to save it. He closed the channel and turned to Marcus. How many pending requests do we have now? Marcus checked the relay. 267, as of this morning. David nodded. Start ranking them by urgency. Stars closest to final threshold first. Marcus pulled up the list and began sorting. And 267 dying solar systems, scattered across a galaxy that had been counting down to darkness, had just moved one step closer to morning. But back at Concordance Station, the high speaker was still waiting. And the question of who controlled the fire had not been answered yet. The second summit was different. Not in location, Concordance Station again, same chamber, same mixed atmosphere common areas, same deliberately neutral architecture, but different in the way that rooms are different when the people in them have changed, when something has happened that cannot be undanded. David Harlan arrived with the same 4-person staff. He sat at the same smaller table. He looked the same granite jaw, same steady eyes, same cup of coffee that was going cold because he kept forgetting to drink it. But the chamber felt different. The Dren representative's presence was different. They had reconstituted more of their collective than before, and their interface systems were broadcasting on additional frequencies, which was, in Dren terms, a sign of increased engagement with the external world. The convocation engineering platform commanders had submitted a separate technical brief to the chamber before the session began, detailing the structural improvements their teams had contributed to the Kira repair. Not a political document, a technical one. The kind of document that says, we were there, we helped, we are thinking about what that means. The high speaker opened without ceremony. Commander Harlan, in your absence from the previous session, this chamber reached a provisional position. We do not endorse the unilateral nature of humanity's initial operation. We maintain that the Cosmic Accords frameworks exist for reasons that remain valid. We do not retract the formal objections lodged against the Kira operation." David nodded. "However," the High Speaker continued, "we acknowledge the outcome. We acknowledge the technical achievement. And we acknowledge that 267 inhabited systems have submitted formal requests for anchor array assistance. Requests that this chamber has no framework to process and no alternative solution to offer." The chamber was quiet. "We are therefore proposing the formation of a new cooperative framework, one that operates within the principle of galactic consensus while acknowledging that consensus, in the current crisis, cannot mean inaction. The framework would be jointly administered. Humanity would lead technical operations. A multi-species oversight council would review prioritization and resource allocation. All operations would be conducted with full transparency." David looked at the High Speaker for a long moment. "What happens to the 267 requests while the framework is being designed?" "We would begin immediately on the 10 highest urgency cases under provisional authorization. The systems that are most critical, the ones that have maybe 30 years left, they can't wait for provisional authorization to be finalized in committee. The process will be expedited." "How expedited?" 30 days. David set down his coffee cup. 15. Another murmur through the chamber. The High Speaker's translated voice, somehow, carried the impression of something that might have been the very distant ancestor of amusement. 20. Done. That was the Kira Accord, named not after the summit or the station or any of the political entities involved, but after a white dwarf in the outer spiral arm that had decided, with some encouragement, not to die. The framework took 19 days to finalize. Not 2019, because Aaron Cole, an Adren Systems architect named, in translated designation, Resonance 7 worked through 2 consecutive nights to resolve a resource allocation dispute that had been stalling the technical annex, and presented the solution to the Joint Drafting Committee at 600 on day 19, with the particular satisfaction of people who have bypassed politics by solving the actual problem. The first 10 anchor arrays beyond Kira were deployed in the following 14 months. Each one was a joint operation, human engineering leads, multi-species fabrication and support teams, Dren design refinements incorporated into every successive generation of the technology. The arrays improved with each deployment. The repair protocols became more efficient. The ignition success rate climbed from 31% to 54% to, by the 8th deployment, 71%. Stars came back. Not quickly, not easily, not without setbacks. The 4th deployment, at a system called Orin's Wake by the human teams, failed on first ignition attempt and required a complete anchor reconfiguration before succeeding on the 3rd try, 90 days behind schedule. The 6th deployment encountered gravitational interference from a nearby neutron star that required 4 months of additional modeling to resolve. Each success was earned, not given. But they came back. In the inhabited systems where the new stars ignited, the reactions were not always what the human teams expected. The species who had resigned themselves to darkness did not uniformly respond with celebration. Some reacted with confusion. Some with anger, genuine anger, directed at humanity, at the disruption of an acceptance they had spent decades building. One species, the Theresi, sent a formal objection to the 3rd array deployment in their system, even as it was being installed, on the grounds that the resurrection of their star without full cultural consultation was a violation of their philosophical sovereignty. David received the Theresi objection personally. He read it, thought about it for a long time, and responded with a message that was later included in the Kira Accord's official commentary as an example of operational philosophy. "We heard you. We disagreed with your conclusion. We understand that this disruption is real and that your grief over the choice you had made is real. We are not asking you to be grateful. We are asking you to stay alive. You can be angry about it later when your sun is warm." The Thuresi did not respond to that message for 8 months. When they finally did, the response contained 3 sentences. "Our children have not seen darkness in 6 months. We understand now that we did not fully understand before. We are still processing." That was enough. By year 3 of the Kira Accord, the Anchor Array network had grown to 47 active installations. The Dyson ring infrastructure, the power generation framework that had begun as a single ring around Kira, had expanded into a linked system, each ring sharing load capacity with adjacent installations, creating a web of artificial stellar support across the galaxy's most threatened regions. The phrase "wired suns" came from a Dren technical document and was immediately adopted by every species in the network as the informal term for stars under Anchor support. It spread because it was accurate, because it was slightly strange, and because it contained, in 2 words, the entire audacity of the project. The idea that a sun could be wired, could be connected, could be maintained by the deliberate act of civilizations that had decided the universe's schedule was negotiable. David Harlan stepped down as operational lead of the Anchor program in year 4, not from exhaustion, not from political pressure, but because he had always understood that the program's survival depended on it not being built around one person. He recommended Aaron Cole as his successor. The Oversight Council confirmed the appointment unanimously, which was the first unanimous vote in the Council's 3-year history. At the handover briefing, David said one thing to Aaron that Aaron would later repeat, in various forms, for the rest of his career. The galaxy didn't need saving by heroes. It needed someone stubborn enough to try a thing that everyone else had decided was impossible, and then stubborn enough again to make sure it kept working after the first try. That's it. That's the whole job. Don't let anyone make it more complicated than that. Aaron didn't. He made it better. In the years that followed, under Aaron's leadership, and with the deep integration of Dren design philosophy, the Anchor Arrays became something beyond their original design. Not just stellar support structures, but the skeleton of a new galactic infrastructure. A physical network that connected inhabited systems not just by communication or trade, but by shared energy, shared light, shared warmth. A galaxy that had been dying, system by system, star by star, had begun slowly, imperfectly, with argument and setback and occasional spectacular failure, to come back. Not to what it had been. You cannot undie a dying thing and get back exactly what it was. The galaxy that was being built was different, more deliberate, more connected, more aware of its own fragility and of what that fragility required from the civilizations living inside it. But it was lit. And somewhere in the outer spiral arm, a star called Kira, 0.08 solar luminosity when it was first ignited, now burning at a stable 0.12 after 2 years of careful anchor calibration, continued to shine. Warm, quiet, impossible. A small sun in a big galaxy, burning because someone decided 31% was enough. If you made it this far, thank you. This story exists because of you. If it moved you, if it made you think, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the universe doesn't decide what's possible. We do. Drop a comment below, would humanity really do it? Would you? And if you haven't yet, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, because this is only one story and there are 1,000 more where this came from. The fire is still burning. Come back and watch it with us.